The wind in Wyoming territory did not just blow. It scoured. It carried the grit of 1,000 miles of empty sagebrush and the cold bite of the mountains to the west, stripping the paint from buildings and the hope from men. Eli Vance pulled the brim of his hat lower against the gust. His eyes narrowed to slits as he rode into the valley that had once been his whole world. 7 years. It had been 7 years since he had turned his back on Windmere. 7 years since he had put his spurs to a horse and ridden out with a chest full of fire and a head full of foolish dreams. He had been a boy then, angry at his father, hungry for a fortune he was sure was waiting for him in the gold fields of the Dakotas or the cattle trails of Texas. He returned now not as a boy, but as something whittled down by time and hard labor. He was lean, his shoulders broad but hunched slightly against the cold, his face a map of lines etched by the sun and the wind. He wore a duster coat stained with the mud of 3 states, and at his hip rested a Colt Navy revolver that had seen more use than he cared to remember. He had not found a fortune. He had found only long days in the saddle, nights sleeping on the hard earth, and the bitter taste of regret. His horse, a roan mare with a white blaze on her nose, stepped carefully over the rutted track. Eli reined her in at the crest of a ridge, looking down at the homestead his father had left him. It was a ruin. The roof of the main cabin sagged like a broken spine. The corral fence had toppled, the wood gray and rotting in the tall grass. Weeds choked the yard where his mother had once tried to grow geraniums in iron pots. It looked like a place where ghosts lived, a testament to failure. Eli felt a tightness in his throat that had nothing to do with the dust. He had come back to claim this land, to try and make something of the name Vance again. But looking at the wreckage, he wondered if he was a fool all over again. He clicked his tongue, urging the mare forward. He would not stop there yet. He needed supplies. He needed whiskey. And, though he refused to admit it even to himself in the silence of his own mind, he needed to see if she was still there. Windmere had not grown much. It had merely aged, like a piece of leather left out in the sun. The boardwalks were warped, and the sign above the livery stable swung on a rusted hinge, screeching a rhythmic complaint. A few horses were tied to the hitching rail outside the Lucky Dollar Saloon, their heads hanging low. Eli rode down the main street, feeling the eyes of the town on him. People here have long memories. He saw Mrs. Gable sweeping her porch, pausing to lean on her broom and squint at him. He saw the blacksmith stop his hammering, wiping soot from his forehead to stare. They recognized the set of his shoulders, perhaps, or the way he sat the saddle. He dismounted in front of Miller's General Store, tying the mare securely. His legs felt stiff. He dusted his coat off with a gloved hand, took a breath of the cold air, and pushed the door open. The bell above the door chimed, a cheerful sound that seemed out of place in the heavy silence of the afternoon. The store smelled of roasted coffee beans, sawdust, and pickle brine, a smell that instantly transported him back a decade. The store was dim, lit only by the gray light filtering through the dirty front windows. At first, he thought he was alone, save for old man Miller dozing behind the counter. But then he heard a soft sound from the back of the store, near the bolts of calico fabric, a cooing sound. Eli stepped forward, his boots heavy on the floorboards. A woman stood with her back to him, examining a spool of blue ribbon. She wore a plain dress of charcoal wool, mended at the hem, and a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pulled back in a severe bun, but a few loose strands escaped to frame her neck. Eli stopped. His heart hammered against his ribs, a sudden, violent rhythm that made him light-headed. He knew that hair. He knew the curve of those shoulders. "Sarah," he said. His voice was rough, unused to the name. She stiffened. The spool of ribbon slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the floor. She turned slowly, as if moving through water. Time had not been gentle to Sarah, but it had not broken her. She was thinner than he remembered, the softness of girlhood stripped away to reveal the sharp, elegant bones of her face. Her eyes were wide, dark and guarded, surrounded by shadows that spoke of sleepless nights. but Eli barely saw her face. His gaze dropped to the bundle she held against her chest. Wrapped in a thick wool blanket was a baby. A child, perhaps 6 or 7 months old, with a tuft of pale hair and round, pink cheeks. The baby was chewing on a wooden teething ring, but stopped to look at Eli with solemn curiosity. The silence in the store stretched, thick and suffocating. "Eli," Sarah whispered. It was not a greeting. It was an accusation. "I heard you were still here," Eli said, taking a step forward. He felt clumsy, too large for the space. "I didn't know." He gestured vaguely toward the child. "I didn't know you had married." Sarah's grip on the baby tightened. She lifted her chin, a gesture of defiance he remembered well from their youth. "I didn't." Eli frowned. He looked at her left hand. It was bare. He looked back at the child. The baby gurgled, reaching a small hand out toward the shiny brass buttons of Eli's coat. "Then whose is it?" Eli asked. The question came out sharper than he intended. Sarah took a step back, putting the corner of a display table between them. "That is none of your concern. Eli Vance, you have been gone for 7 years. You don't get to walk in here and ask questions." "I'm back now," Eli said. "I'm back for the homestead." "Then go to the homestead," she snapped. Her voice trembled, edging on panic. "Buy your flour and your beans and go. Leave us be." Eli looked at the baby again. The child shifted, the blanket falling away slightly to reveal a small, dimpled chin. The baby blinked, and Eli felt a jolt go through him like a lightning strike. The eyes, they were not Sarah's dark brown. They were gray, a storm cloud gray, rimmed with a darker charcoal. They were the exact shade of his mother's eyes, the exact shade that stared back at him from the shaving mirror every morning. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Eli looked from the child to Sarah, his mind racing, trying to do the arithmetic of time. He had been gone 7 years, yes, but he had come back, just once. A year ago, passing through on a cattle drive to Montana. He had stolen one night in Windmere, one night of weakness and whiskey and a desperate, quiet meeting in the hayloft of her father's barn before he had ridden out again. Convinced he was no good for her. He had never written. He had never looked back. "Sarah," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "How old is she?" Sarah's face went white. She clutched the baby so tight the child began to whimper. "No," she said. "The eyes," Eli said, stepping closer. "Sarah, look at her eyes." "No!" she cried out. The sound woke Old Man Miller, who snorted and sat up behind the counter. "The baby is not yours," Sarah blurted, her voice rising to a pitch of hysteria. "Do you hear me? She isn't yours." "She looks like my mother," Eli said, stunned. "She looks like her father," Sarah hissed. "A man who stayed, a man who didn't run away the moment things got hard." She snatched up her basket from the counter, abandoning the blue ribbon on the floor. "Get out of my way! Eli!" He did not move. He stood frozen, staring at the child. The baby began to cry, a thin, wailing sound that tore at something deep inside him. "Move!" Sarah shoved past him, her shoulders striking his chest hard. She rushed for the door, the bell chiming frantically as she threw it open and fled into the cold street. Eli stood alone in the smell of coffee and dust. He looked down at the blue ribbon on the floor. He stooped and picked it up. It was silk, fine and soft, too expensive for a woman wearing a mended dress. He put the ribbon in his pocket and walked to the counter. "Whiskey," he told Miller, "and a bag of tobacco." The Lucky Dollar Saloon was a dismal place to spend a night, but Eli had nowhere else. The roof of his father's cabin leaked, and he had no desire to sleep in the wet. He sat at a table in the corner, a bottle of cheap rye whiskey in front of him. The saloon was quiet, occupied only by a few ranch hands playing poker near the stove and a piano player who seemed to know only 3 songs, playing them in a mournful loop. Eli poured a glass and drank it down. It burned, but not enough to sear away the image of the baby girl. "The baby's not yours." She had said it with such force, such conviction. And the timeline, it was tight. If the baby was 6 months old, And he had been here 12 months ago. It fits. It fit perfectly. But if she was 8 months old, 9, then she wasn't his. But the eyes, he poured another drink. He closed his eyes and let the noise of the saloon fade. Suddenly, he was not in a drafty saloon in 1887. He was 19 years old, standing in the tall grass by the creek, the summer sun hot on his back. Sarah was there. She was 17, wearing a yellow dress that was bright as a dandelion against the green of the willows. She was laughing, splashing water at him, her feet bare in the mud. Flashback. "You can't leave. Eli," she had said later, lying beside him on the bank, drying in the sun. Her hand was in his, her fingers calloused from work but gentle. "We have a life here." What life? Eli had argued. Frustration boiling in his young blood. Working myself to death on land that won't yield, watching my father drink himself into the grave. There's more out there. Sarah, there's gold. There's land in California where the fruit grows right off the trees. "I don't care about fruit," she whispered, rolling onto her side to look at him. Her eyes were full of a trust that terrified him. "I care about you." He had kissed her then, tasting the sweetness of the grass and the salt of her skin. It was a promise he made with his body because he could not make it with words. "I'll come back," he had sworn to her the night he left. They stood by the back gate of her father's house, the moon high and white. "I'll make a pile of money, Sarah, enough to build you a real house, with glass windows, and a piano. Just come back," she had said, gripping his lapels. "I don't need a piano, just come back to me." He had ridden away feeling like a hero. He had no idea he was riding away from the only thing that would ever matter. End flashback. Eli opened his eyes. The saloon was darker now. The poker game had broken up. He rubbed a hand over his face. He had come back, eventually, a year ago. He had ridden in under the cover of darkness, ashamed of his empty pockets, just wanting to see her. He had found her. They had spent one night, one reckless, desperate night where 7 years of hunger had consumed them both. And then, the next morning, looking at the poverty of the town and feeling the weight of his own failure. He had left before dawn. He had written a note saying he would send for her when he had something to offer. He never sent it to her. He never had anything to offer. Until now. Now he had the deed to the land, found in a letter in a Cheyenne post office. The only inheritance his father had managed to keep. "Not yours," he muttered to the empty glass. He wanted to believe her. It would be easier if the child belonged to some other man. Then he could just be the failure who left. But if that child was his, then he was something far worse. He was the man who had abandoned them, a mile outside of town. The wind howled around the small, bleak cemetery on the hill. Sarah knelt in the dead grass, her knees soaked by the damp earth. The baby, Clara, was asleep in a basket she had placed in the lee of a granite headstone. The stone read, "Martha Ellen Cross, beloved wife and mother, 1835, 1878. Sarah pressed her forehead against the cold stone. She was shivering, though she wore every layer she owned. "He's back, Mama," she whispered into the wind. "He's back, and he saw her." She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the tears that threatened to freeze on her cheeks. Seeing Eli had been like taking a physical blow. He looked older, harder. The boyish softness was gone, replaced by a dangerous kind of stillness. But his eyes, God, his eyes were the same. And Clara had looked right at him. Guilt washed over Sarah, a heavy, suffocating tide. She had lied. She had looked into the face of the man she had loved for a decade and lied with a speed that frightened her. But she had to. She looked down at the sleeping baby. Clara was innocent. She was perfect. And she was a secret that Sarah had nearly killed herself to keep. If Eli knew the truth, the whole truth, not just the simple fact of paternity, but the horror that had surrounded it, he would tear this town apart. He would go after the man responsible. And that man owned the law in Winmere. That man owned the bank, the land, and the souls of half the men in the valley. Silas Thorne. Just the thought of the name made Sarah's stomach turn. Silas had courted her after Eli left the first time. He had been charming, persistent, and rich. When she refused him, repeatedly, his charm had curdled into something dark. If Eli knew what Silas had done, Eli would kill him, and then Eli would hang, and Sarah would be left alone again, but this time with a baby and a tombstone where her love used to be. "I can't tell him," she said at her mother's grave. "I have to make him go. He has to leave before Silas finds out he's here." But even as she said it, a treacherous part of her heart ached. She remembered the way Eli had looked in the store, the way he had picked up the ribbon, the way he had looked at Clara. She was so tired. She had been fighting for survival for so long, chopping her own wood, shooting rabbits for stew, sewing until her fingers bled to pay for flour. The idea of leaning on someone, of having Eli's broad shoulders between her and the world, was a temptation so sweet it tasted like poison. A flake of snow landed on her hand. Then another. Sarah looked up. The sky was a bruised purple. Winter is coming early this year. The air smelled of metal and ice. She scrambled up, grabbing the basket. "Come on, Clara," she murmured. "We have to get home." She hurried down the hill, the wind pushing at her back like a hand trying to shove her toward a destiny she was running from. The snow began in earnest 2 days later. It was a dry, stinging snow that drove horizontally across the plains, banking up against the sides of the buildings and turning the world into a grayscale blur. Eli spent the days at the homestead. He worked with a manic intensity, trying to outrun his thoughts. He found a rusty hammer and a keg of nails in the barn. He spent hours on the roof of the cabin, replacing the rotted shingles with wood he salvaged from the fallen fence. The wind tried to tear him off the roof, biting through his duster, freezing his fingers until they were clumsy claws. But he did not stop. He cleared the debris from the main room. He shoveled out the rat droppings and the drifted dirt. He fixed the hinges on the door so it would close against the storm. It was hard, brutal work, and he welcomed it. Every muscle ache was a distraction. Every smashed thumb was a penance. But at night, when the fire in the hearth sputtered low and the wind screamed down the chimney, he could not keep his mind on the cabin. He sat on a broken chair, whittling a piece of pine, and his gaze kept drifting to the window. Through the swirling snow, he could not see the town, but he knew it was there. He knew she was there. He wondered if she had enough wood. He wondered if the roof of her small cottage, the one on the edge of town where she lived alone, was holding up under the snow. He wondered about the baby. He told himself to pack up and leave. The land was worthless without cattle to graze on it, and he had no money to buy stock. He should sell the deed to the bank and ride for California like he had planned 7 years ago. But he didn't leave. On the 4th morning, the snow stopped. The sun broke through, blindingly bright on the white drifts. The temperature plummeted, the air so cold it crackled. Eli stood on the porch of his father's cabin, drinking a cup of bitter coffee. He looked at the work he had done. The cabin was standing. It was a shelter. He looked toward town. A plume of smoke rose from the cluster of buildings in the distance. He tossed the rest of the coffee into the snow. It hissed. He walked to the barn and saddled the roan mare. He didn't put his work gloves on. He packed a saddlebag with the jerky and dried apples he had bought at the store. He added a small sack of nails. He wasn't going to leave. Not yet. Not until he knew the truth about the eyes that were gray like his mother's. He swung into the saddle and turned the mare toward town, toward the small cottage on the outskirts, riding into the teeth of the cold. The smoke from Sarah's chimney rose in a thin, gray pillar against the pale morning sky, the only sign of life in a landscape buried under 2 feet of fresh snow. Eli Vance sat atop his horse at the edge of the tree line, watching that smoke. He had a burlap sack tied to his saddle horn, heavy with flour, dried beans, and a tin of coffee he had purchased with his last few dollars. He told himself it was payment. She was raising a child alone in a harsh country, and if that child was his, he owed her more than a sack of beans. If the child was not his, as she claimed, then he was just a neighbor doing a kindness. Either way, He could not sit in his own cabin and eat while a woman and a baby might be starving 2 miles down the road. He nudged the roan mare forward. The snow crunched loudly under the hoof, the sound echoing in the unnatural stillness of the valley. When he reached the small cabin, the yard was a smooth, unbroken sheet of white. No footprints led to the woodpile. No path was cleared to the privy. A cold knot tightened in Eli's stomach. He dismounted and tied the horse to the porch rail. The wood of the railing was gray and splintered, shaking under his hand. The whole place had a lean to it, as if it were tired of standing up against the Wyoming wind. Eli stepped onto the porch, the boards groaning under his boots, and knocked on the door. There was no answer. "Sarah," he called out. His voice sounded rough, swallowed by the snow. "I brought some things." Silence. Then the faint scrape of a chair leg against wood. "Go away, Eli." Her voice was muffled by the thick timber door, but the steel in it was clear enough. "I am not asking to come in," Eli said, leaning his shoulder against the door frame. "I'm leaving a sack of supplies on the porch, flour, coffee, some sugar for the little one. When she's old enough." "We don't need your charity," she replied instantly. "It isn't charity," he said. "It's a debt. You owe me nothing." "I owe you 7 years, he said to the wood grain. The silence on the other side stretched out, heavy and vibrating with things unsaid. Eli bent down to untie the sack from his shoulder, setting it gently on the floorboards. As he straightened up, a movement caught his eye. The cabin had one small window facing the porch, covered by an oilcloth that had been pulled back slightly at the corner. Pressed against the glass was a small hand, and then a face. It was the baby, Clara. She was pulled up on something, maybe a chair or a low table, peering out at the strange shape on her porch. Her eyes were wide, filled with that gray, storm cloud color that stopped Eli's heart in his chest. She blinked at him, her breath fogging the cold glass. Then she smiled, a gummy, drooling, lopsided smile that lit up the dreary morning. Eli froze. He felt a smile tugging at his own mouth, unbidden and terrifying. He raised a gloved hand and gave a small, awkward wave. The oilcloth was yanked shut instantly. The view of the child vanished. "Leave the food if you must," Sarah's voice came through the door, trembling now. "But don't come back." Eli stared at the blank window for a long moment. He touched the brim of his hat, though she could not see him. "I'll see you, Sarah," he murmured. He walked back to his horse, his boots breaking the pristine snow. He did not ride away immediately. Instead, he walked the perimeter of the cabin. He saw the fence line buried in drifts, the rails fallen where the nails had rusted through. He saw the wood pile, dangerously low, the logs uncut and too heavy for a woman to manage easily. He saw the barn roof, missing shingles where the melting snow would surely drip through and rot the beams. He tightened the cinch on his saddle. He would leave, as she asked, but he would not stay away. The next day, Eli returned. He did not go to the door. He did not announce himself. He simply rode to the back of the property, tied his horse in the shelter of the trees, and took his axe from the saddle. He spent the morning at the woodpile. He worked with a rhythmic, punishing intensity, swinging the axe until his shoulders burned and his breath came in white clouds. He split the heavy logs into neat, manageable stove lengths, stacking them high against the side of the cabin where the eaves would keep them dry. Sarah never came out, but he felt her watching. He felt her eyes on him from the window as he stripped off his duster, working in his wool shirt despite the biting cold. He felt the weight of her gaze as he wiped sweat from his forehead. Inside the cabin, Sarah stood back from the window, hidden in the shadows of the room. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "He is only doing it for the land," she told herself, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "He sees the fences down and the roof leaking, and he thinks he is protecting his investment. He thinks he can fix the place up and then take it, just like everyone else." But her memory betrayed her. She watched the way his back muscles moved under the gray wool shirt. the way he paused to rest his hand on the axe handle, looking out over the valley with that quiet, brooding stillness she used to tease him about. She remembered the texture of that shirt. She remembered the heat of his skin on a summer night by the creek, the way his rough hands had felt impossibly gentle when he touched her face. She turned away from the window, walking to the cradle where Clara lay sleeping. Sarah looked down at her daughter, tracing the curve of the baby's cheek. "He doesn't know," she whispered. "And he can't know. If Eli knew the truth, the fragile peace she had built would shatter." Her mind, unbidden, slipped back to the time after Eli had left. The loneliness had been a physical ache, a hollowness in her chest that she woke up with every morning. But she had carried a secret joy then, the knowledge of the child growing inside her. It was her tether to him. Then came Silas Thorne. The flashback hit her with the force of a physical blow, buckling her knees. Flashback. It was late autumn, 3 months after Eli had ridden away for the second time. Sarah was showing, but only just, a slight thickening of her waist that she hid under loose aprons. Silas Thorne owned the Double T Ranch, the largest spread in the territory. He was a handsome man in a sharp, predatory way, with silver on his spurs and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He had brought her gifts at first, a bolt of silk, a comb made of tortoiseshell. She had returned them all. "I am waiting for Eli Vance," she had told him, "standing on this very porch." Silas laughed. "Vance is a drifter. Sarah, he's dust in the wind. I can give you the world. I can give you a house with servants. I can make you a queen in this valley." "I don't want to be a queen," she had said. "Please, Mr. Thorne, leave me be." His smile had vanished then. He came back a week later. It was night. The wind was howling, masking the sound of his approach until the door burst open. Sarah had been sewing by the fire. She stood up, clutching her scissors, her heart seizing in terror. Silas stood in the doorway, smelling of whiskey and cold air. He was not smiling. "You think you're too good for me," he sneered, stepping inside and kicking the door shut behind him. "You think a little dirt farmer's daughter can look down on Silas Thorne?" "Get out," Sarah warned, backing toward the table. "I have a gun." "You won't use it." He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He was heavy, strong, fueled by a bruised ego and the arrogance of a man who had never been told no. She fought him. She fought with everything she had, scratching, biting, screaming for neighbors who were too far away to hear. But he was too strong. He threw her to the floor, pinning her down with his weight. The violence was a blur of pain and suffocating fear. But through the horror, one thought screamed in Sarah's mind. "The baby! Protect the baby!" She stopped fighting him physically, curling into herself, taking the assault in a dissociation of silence, praying only that his violence would not harm the life inside her. When he was done, he stood up and adjusted his belt, looking down at her with cold contempt. "You're not so high and mighty now," he spat. "You tell anyone about this, Sarah, and I will burn this shack to the ground with you inside it. Who would believe you anyway? The whore who waits for a ghost." He left her bleeding on the rug. End flashback. Sarah gripped the edge of the cradle until her knuckles turned white. She had never told a soul, not the sheriff, who drank whiskey on Silas's porch every Sunday, not the doctor. When her belly grew undeniable a few months later, the whispers started. The timeline didn't match up for Eli. People said he had been gone too long. It must have been a peddler, or maybe Silas Thorne. People whispered with a wink, knowing his reputation. But because she said nothing, because she refused to name the father, the town turned on her. They called her loose. They called her a sinner. They crossed the street when she walked by. When Silas found out she was pregnant, he had come back once. He offered her money, a thick envelope of greenbacks. "To keep your mouth shut," he had said, assuming the child was his bastard. She had thrown the money in the fire right in front of him. "She isn't yours," Sarah had told him, her voice trembling with hatred. "She will never be yours." And she wasn't. Clara was Eli's. She was the one pure thing that had survived the darkness. The week wore on, and Eli kept coming. He brought shingles from his own barn and patched her roof. He mended the corral fence, driving new posts into the frozen earth. He found a gap in the chicken coop where a fox could get in and boarded it up. He never asked to come inside. He never asked for thanks. On the 5th day, the sun was shining, melting the snow into slush. Eli was by the coop, scattering some of the corn he had brought. Sarah opened the door and walked out onto the porch. She held Clara on her hip. Eli stopped, his hand frozen mid-toss. He took off his hat. "Morning," he said. "You're wasting your time," Sarah said, though her voice lacked the venom it had carried before. "I can't pay you for any of this. Didn't ask for payment." Clara let out a squeal, pointing a chubby finger at the chickens pecking at the corn. "She likes the birds," Eli said, a softness entering his face that made Sarah's chest ache. "She likes anything that moves." Sarah said. She hesitated, then walked down the steps. She stayed a safe distance away, near the water pump. "Why are you doing this, Eli?" "The place needs fixing," he said simply. He crouched down, holding out a handful of corn. "Come here, little one. Watch this." He clicked his tongue, and a bold Rhode Island red hen strutted up to his hand, pecking at the grain. Clara giggled. A bright, bubbling sound. She wiggled in Sarah's arms, leaning toward Eli. "She wants to do it," Eli said, looking up at Sarah. "Can she?" Sarah looked at him. She looked for the boy she had loved, and she saw him, buried under the lines of hardship. But she also saw a man she didn't know, a man who had stayed away for 7 years. "Careful," she said. "They peck hard." Eli stood up slowly and stepped closer. He didn't reach for Sarah. He reached only for the baby's hand. His fingers were large, calloused, and stained with work, but he took Clara's tiny hand with a reverence that was painful to watch. "Open your hand flat," he instructed the baby softly. "Like a plate. There. Now watch." He sprinkled a little corn onto Clara's palm. The hen approached, cocking its head. Clara went still, her eyes wide. The hen pecked gently. It tickled. Clara shrieked with laughter and pulled her hand back, scattering the corn. "You see?" Eli grinned, a true smile that cracked the stoic mask of his face. "She's a natural." Sarah felt a sudden stinging in her eyes. It was a scene she had dreamed of 1,000 times in the lonely nights. Eli, a child, the simple piece of a family. Seeing it now, stolen and fragile in the shadow of her secrets, was almost unbearable. "Don't," she whispered. Eli looked at her, the smile fading. "Don't what?" "Don't make her like you," Sarah said fiercely. "Don't make her look for you in the mornings, because you're going to leave. You always leave." "I'm not leaving. Sarah, you say that now, but the winter will pass. The road will open up. And you'll remember that there's nothing here but hard work and a ruined name." She hoisted Clara higher on her hip, turning away. "Don't confuse her. Eli, it's cruel." She walked back to the house, leaving him standing among the chickens, his hat in his hand. Night fell early and hard. The wind picked up again, rattling the window panes. Eli was still there. He had built a fire in the yard to burn the brush he had cleared, and he was sitting on a stump, smoking a pipe. The glow of the embers illuminated his face in flashes of orange. Sarah put Clara to bed. She paced the small main room of the cabin. She tried to mend a sock, but her hands were shaking. She couldn't stand it anymore. The silence, the presence of him just outside her door, like a sentinel or a ghost. She threw a shawl over her shoulders and marched out onto the porch. "Go home! Eli!" she shouted over the wind. Eli looked up. He knocked the ash from his pipe and stood. He walked to the foot of the porch steps. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows across the yard. "I'm keeping the coyotes off the chickens," he said calmly. "I don't need you to keep the coyotes off," Sarah cried, gripping the railing. "I have done it myself for a year. I have done everything myself. I don't need you to come here and play hero now that the hard part is done." "The hard part?" Eli stepped up onto the first stair. "Sarah, you're living in a shack with a roof that was half caved in. You have no wood. You have a baby. And whose fault is that? She lashed out. Where were you when she was born? Where were you when the town was spitting on me in the street? You were drifting. You were chasing gold that doesn't exist. Eli flinched. He took another step up, standing on the porch now, towering over her. I know, he said, his voice low and intense. I know I failed you. I live with that every second of every day. But I am here now. It's too late, Sarah shouted. She shoved him. Her hand struck his chest, hard, pushing against the heavy wool of his coat. You can't just fix a fence and think it fixes us. You can't patch a roof and think it covers up the fact that you left me. She shoved him again, tears hot on her face. Go away. Go away before you ruin everything again. He didn't move. He stood like a rock against her blows, and then, as she raised her hands to push him a third time, he caught her wrists. His grip was firm, arresting her motion instantly. Sarah, he said. Let go. She gasped, struggling. Sarah, stop. He pulled her closer, not violently, but with an inexorable strength. She stumbled against him, her chest colliding with his. She looked up, breathless, her face inches from his. The anger in the air shifted, transmuted in a heartbeat into something hotter, something desperate. They froze. The wind howled around the corner of the cabin, but on the porch, the silence was deafening. Sarah could feel the heat radiating from him. She could smell the wood smoke on his clothes, the tobacco, the scent of the man she had never stopped wanting. Eli looked down at her, his eyes dark and searching. His gaze dropped to her mouth, then back to her eyes. His thumbs moved slightly against the pulse points of her wrists, which were beating like trapped birds. Tell me to go, he whispered. Tell me you feel nothing, and I will get on that horse and ride until the ocean stops me. Sarah trembled. Her body betrayed her. She wanted to lean into him. She wanted to bury her face in his coat and let him hold her up. She wanted to taste him and forget the last 7 years. But then the shadow of Silas Thorne fell over her mind. The threat, the secret, the danger that Eli's presence brought to Clara. If she loved him, she had to save him, and saving him meant sending him away. She wrenched her wrists free from his grip with a sudden, violent jerk. She stumbled back toward the door, her breath hitching in a sob. I feel nothing, she lied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. I feel nothing but pity for a man who has no home. Eli recoiled as if she had slapped him. His face shuddered, the openness vanishing behind the mask of the drifter once more. Fair enough, he said quietly. He turned and walked down the steps, moving past the dying fire without looking back. He mounted his horse and rode into the darkness, leaving Sarah standing alone on the porch, shaking in the cold, her heart breaking all over again. The mercury in the thermometer nailed to the porch post dropped like a stone thrown down a well. It had been cold before, a standard Wyoming bite, but this was something else, a sudden, brittle freeze that turned the air into glass and froze the breath in a man's lungs before he could exhale. Inside the small cabin on the edge of town, Sarah paced the floorboards, her boots making a hollow thudding sound in the dim light of the kerosene lamp. In her arms, Clara was burning up. The baby's cough had started as a dry rasp in the afternoon, but by midnight, it had deepened into a terrifying, wet rattle that shook her tiny frame. Her skin was hot and dry, her face flushed a dark, unnatural crimson. Sarah had tried everything she knew. She had tented a blanket over a pot of boiling water to make steam. She had rubbed goose grease and turpentine on the baby's chest. She had prayed until her throat was raw. Nothing was working. Clara let out a wheezing cry that ended in a choke. She arched her back, fighting for air, her small fists flailing against the blanket. Panic, cold and sharp as a knife, sliced through Sarah's exhaustion. She was losing her. She was alone in the dark, miles from a doctor who was likely too drunk to ride anyway, and her daughter was dying in her arms. She did not let herself think. She did not let herself weigh the pride she had clung to so fiercely for the last week. She simply acted. She wrapped Clara in 2 wool blankets, swaddling her so tightly only her nose and mouth were visible. She threw on her own heavy coat, wrapped a scarf around her head, and shoved her feet into her boots. Outside. The wind hit her like a physical blow. The snow was not falling. It was being driven across the earth in horizontal sheets, stinging her eyes. Sarah stumbled to the barn, her hands numb as she fumbled with the saddle cinch. The horse, a sturdy bay gelding, snorted and stomped, unhappy to be dragged into the freezing night. "Please," she whispered to the animal, her voice snatched away by the gale. "Please be sure-footed tonight." She mounted awkwardly, clutching the bundle of blankets to her chest with one arm, gripping the reins with the other. She turned the horse's head not toward town, but toward the ridge, toward the homestead, toward Eli. The ride was a blur of terror. The wind screamed in her ears, drowning out the sound of the horse's hooves. The cold seeped through her coat, seeking her bones, but she hunched over Clara, using her own body as a shield. Every time the horse slipped on a patch of hidden ice, Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She did not know how long it took. It might have been 20 minutes, it might have been an hour, but finally, the dark shape of the Vance cabin loomed out of the swirling white. A faint glow came from the window. He was awake. Sarah rode right up to the porch, sliding from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped. Her legs nearly gave way, numb and stiff, but she caught herself on the railing. She pounded on the door with her fist. "Eli! Eli, help me!" The door swung open instantly, and Eli stood there, a rifle in his hand, his chest bare, suspenders hanging loose over his trousers. His eyes went from the rifle to Sarah, and then to the bundle in her arms. He saw the terror in her face, and the weapon was lowered and set aside in one fluid motion. "Get in!" he barked, reaching out to pull her across the threshold. He kicked the door shut against the wind, sealing out the roar. The cabin was warm, smelling of pine pitch and old coffee. "It's Clara," Sarah gasped, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form the words. "She can't breathe. She's burning up." Eli didn't ask questions. He took the bundle from her arms. He carried the baby to the hearth, where the fire was banked low. He knelt and quickly fed kindling into the embers, blowing on them until flames licked up, bright and hot. He unwrapped the blankets. Clara lay limp, her breathing shallow and raspy, her chest heaving with the effort. "Croup," Eli said, his voice calm, though his jaw was set tight. "Or lung fever. She's too cold on the outside and too hot on the inside." He sat on the bearskin rug in front of the fire. "Take the kettle," he ordered Sarah, not looking up. "Put more water on. We need moisture in the air." Sarah moved automatically, her hands shaking as she filled the kettle from the bucket and swung the iron arm over the fire. Eli began to unbutton his trousers, shucking them off until he was in his long johns. Then he unbuttoned the top of the woolen union suit, exposing his chest. He stripped Clara of her nightgown, leaving her only in her diaper. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked, her voice thin. "Old trail remedy." Eli muttered, "She needs heat, but not dry heat. She needs life." He lay back against the wood box, propping himself up, and placed the naked, feverish baby directly against his bare skin, tucking her small head under his chin. He pulled the heavy fur rug up over both of them, creating a cocoon that trapped his body heat with hers. "The fire is too harsh," he explained softly, his hand rubbing Clara's small back in slow, rhythmic circles beneath the fur. "She needs to borrow my strength for a while." Sarah stood by the table, still in her coat, shivering violently as the adrenaline crashed. She watched them. She watched the large, scarred hand of the man she loved soothing the child he didn't know was his. She watched Clara's tiny hand curl instinctively into the hair on Eli's chest. The sight broke something inside her. The dam she had built out of pride and fear and silence finally gave way. She sank to the floor, her back against the table leg, and buried her face in her hands. The sobs came tearing out of her, ugly and jagged. Eli looked up. He didn't move. He couldn't, without disturbing the baby, but his gaze was intense, anchoring her. "She's fighting. Sarah," he said gently. "Listen, her breath is hitching less." Sarah couldn't stop crying. It wasn't just the fear of Clara. It was everything. It was the 7 years of waiting. It was the violence of Silas Thorne. It was the loneliness of the pregnancy. It was the cruelty of the town. It was the unbearable weight of the lie she was telling the only man who had ever been kind to her. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I'm so sorry." "You have nothing to be sorry for," Eli said. "You got her here. You did good." "No," she wept. "You don't know. You don't know anything." Eli went quiet. He continued to rub Clara's back. The only sounds in the cabin were the crackle of the fire, the baby's wheezing breath, and Sarah's weeping. After a long time, Sarah wiped her face with her sleeve. She looked at Eli. The firelight cast deep shadows across his face, making him look ancient and weary. "I didn't marry anyone," she whispered. Eli watched her. "I figured that, and I wasn't with anyone. Not the way you think." Eli's hand on the baby's back stilled for a fraction of a second, then resumed its rhythm. "Tell me." "It was Silas Thorne," she said. The name tasted like bile. "He wanted me to marry him. After you left, he wouldn't take no for an answer." Eli's eyes went flat and dark, like obsidian. "What did he do, Sarah?" "He came to the house," she said, staring into the fire because she couldn't look at Eli. "One night, he broke the door. He forced his way in." The silence that followed was terrifying. It was a silence so heavy it felt like the roof beams might snap under the weight of it. "He hurt you," Eli said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "And the town?" Eli asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Why does the town look at you like that?" "Because I wouldn't tell them," Sarah said. "I wouldn't tell them it was him. If I did, he said he would burn me out. He owns the sheriff. Eli, you know he does. So I let them think I was loose. I let them think I had a lover who left." Eli closed his eyes. A muscle in his jaw jumped. Once, twice. His grip on the baby tightened protectively, pulling Clara closer to his heartbeat. "And her?" Eli asked softly. "Is she his?" This was the moment. The truth was right there, sitting on the tip of her tongue. "She is yours." I was pregnant before he ever touched me. But she looked at Eli's face. She saw the murderous rage rising behind his eyes. If he knew Clara was his, and that Silas had touched the mother of his child, touched his family, Eli would ride out tonight. He would go to the Double T Ranch and he would kill Silas Thorne, and then the law would hang him. She could not lose him. Not to a hangman's noose. Not now. "The baby is not yours," Sarah said. The lie was softer this time, weeping with tragedy, but it was still a lie. She let the implication hang in the air that Clara was the result of that night of violence, or perhaps a result of the chaos that followed. She did not say she is Silas's. She just said she is not yours. Eli let out a breath that was half a groan. He looked down at the sleeping infant. He didn't recoil. He didn't push her away. Instead, he bowed his head and kissed the top of Clara's wispy hair. "It doesn't matter," he said. His voice was thick with emotion. "It doesn't matter whose blood she has. She is here, and you are here." He looked up at Sarah, and the ferocity in his gaze made her shiver. "I should have been here," he rasped. "I should have never left you. If I had been here, he wouldn't have dared to set foot on your porch. You couldn't have known," Sarah whispered. "I promise you." Eli swore, the words sounding like a blood oath. "He will never touch you again, either of you. I don't care who her father is. As long as I am breathing, you are under my protection." Sarah looked at him, this hardened, scarred drifter who was holding another man's supposed child as if she were the most precious thing in the world, and she fell in love with him all over again. It was a painful, desperate love, sharper than the cold outside. "Rest, Sarah," Eli said gently. "She's sleeping. The fever is breaking. I can feel the sweat on her." Sarah was too exhausted to argue. She crawled over to Eli's bedroll, which was laid out near the fire. She lay down, pulling the quilt up to her chin. She watched Eli for a long time. The way he sat sentinel against the wood box, the firelight playing on his face, the rifle within arm's reach, the baby safe against his chest. She fell asleep to the sound of the wind, feeling safer than she had in years. Morning broke with a gray, sullen light. The storm was still raging, rattling the door on its hinges, trapping them in a world of white. Sarah woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. She sat up, disoriented for a moment, until she saw Eli standing at the stove. He was dressed now, his shirt sleeves rolled up. Clara was sitting in a wooden crate that Eli had lined with a blanket. She was playing with a spoon, banging it happily against the side of the box. She looked pale, but her eyes were bright, and the terrible wheeze was gone. "She's hungry," Eli said without turning around. "Ate a bowl of mush already." Sarah threw off the quilt and went to the crate. She picked Clara up, burying her face in the baby's neck. Clara smelled of wood smoke and Eli. "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice husky with sleep. Eli turned. He poured a cup of coffee and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed, and the contact sent a jolt through Sarah that nearly made her spill the hot liquid. "Storm's bad," Eli said, looking out the window. "Drifts are 4 feet deep against the barn. You can't ride back yet?" So they waited. The day passed in a strange, suspended reality. It was a glimpse of a life that could have been. Eli whittled a small horse for Clara out of a piece of firewood. Sarah mended a tear in Eli's duster. They ate beans and bacon and talked about small things: the price of cattle, the harshness of the winter, the memories of their childhood that didn't hurt to touch. They did not speak of Silas. They did not speak of the lie. But outside, the world was not pausing. In the town of Windermere, the saloon was doing brisk business despite the weather. Men stamped the snow off their boots and crowded around the potbelly stove. Silas Thorne was there, buying a round for the house. "Seen that drifter, Vance?" Silas asked loudly, leaning against the bar. "Squatting on land that ought to be condemned. And I hear he's got company." He laughed, a dark, ugly sound. "That crosswoman, running out there in the middle of the night, I always knew she was loose. But taking her bastard to a squatter's shack? Birds of a feather, I suppose." The men muttered. Some looked uncomfortable, but most drank the whiskey Silas bought. The seeds were planted. The narrative was being written. Twisting Sarah's desperation into depravity, painting Eli not as a savior, but as a vagrant taking advantage of a fallen woman. By late afternoon, the wind died down. The snow stopped falling, leaving the world silent and buried. "I have to go," Sarah said, standing by the window. "If I don't get back, the animals will freeze, and people will talk." "Let them talk," Eli said, standing up. "But you're right about the animals." He went to the barn to saddle the horses. Sarah wrapped Clara back up in the blankets, her heart heavy. This little bubble of safety was popping. She had to go back to the cold, empty cabin, back to the fear of Silas Thorne. When she walked into the barn, Eli was tightening the girth on her gelding. The air in the barn was cold, smelling of hay and horse sweat. "Eli," she said. He turned. He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You don't have to go back there," he said. "Stay here. The cabin is small, but it's warm. I can build a partition." "I can't," Sarah said. "This is your land, Eli, not mine, and until things are settled with Silas. I can't bring that trouble to your doorstep more than I already have." "I want the trouble," Eli said. He took a step toward her. "I want all of it. I want you." "You don't know what you want," Sarah argued, stepping back until her shoulders hit the rough wood of a support beam. "You think you do, because you're feeling guilty for leaving. But you'll look at her," she gestured to the baby, "and you'll wonder. You'll hate me for it eventually." "Stop it," Eli growled. He closed the distance, pinning her with his body, though he was careful not to crush the baby she held. "I am done wondering. I am done drifting. I look at you and I see the only thing that ever made sense. Eli, no." "Yes." He leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was 7 years of hunger and anger and regret all crashing together. Eli's mouth was hot and rough against hers. One of his hands tangled in her hair, pulling her head back, deepening the kiss. Sarah made a small sound in her throat, a protest that died instantly. She melted against him. Her free hand came up to grip the collar of his coat, pulling him closer. She opened her mouth to him, tasting the coffee and the desperation. For a moment, there was no cold, no Silas, no lies. There was just the friction of their bodies, the heat of his hand on her waist, the overwhelming, undeniable fact that they belonged to each other. She moaned into his mouth, a sound of pure want. Then, the baby shifted between them, making a small noise of complaint. Reality crashed back in. Sarah remembered the lie. She remembered that if she let this happen, if she let him claim her, he would claim the vengeance that came with her, and he would die. She shoved him away. "No!" she gasped. Stumbling back, her lips were swollen, her eyes wide and wild. "No, Eli, we can't!" Eli stood there, his chest heaving, his eyes black with desire. "Why?" "Because it's not that simple," Sarah cried, trembling. "Because you can't just fix 7 years with a kiss. Because I can't let you—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "I can't let you die for me." She turned and scrambled onto her horse, her movements jerky and ungraceful. "Open the door, Eli!" Eli stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. Then, without a word, he walked to the barn doors and shoved them open. The white expanse of the valley lay before them, cold and indifferent. Sarah rode out. She didn't look back. Eli stood in the doorway of the barn, the cold air biting at his flushed face. He watched the dark figure of the horse and rider cut a path through the deep snow, getting smaller and smaller until they were just a speck against the white. He touched his lips where she had kissed him. He could still taste her. He turned back to his horse. He had promised to protect her, and he would. He mounted the roan mare and checked his rifle in the scabbard. He wouldn't ride with her. She had made it clear she didn't want him to, but he would ride a mile behind her. He would watch from the ridge until he saw the smoke rising from her chimney, until he knew she was safe inside. And then, tomorrow, he will go into town. He had heard the wind whispering, and he knew Silas Thorne was talking. It was time for Eli Vance to stop fixing fences and start fixing the rot in Windmere. 3 days passed, 3 days of silence that hung over the valley like the heavy, slate-gray clouds that refused to break. Eli Vance tried to stay on his own land. He busied himself with the endless, back-breaking labor of reclaiming a homestead that nature had spent 7 years trying to swallow. He mended the corral fence until his hands were blistered and raw. He chopped wood until his shoulders screamed. He scrubbed the floors of the cabin until the wood was pale and splinter-free. But he could not scrub the memory of Sarah's mouth from his mind. He could not chop away the image of her riding away into the snow, small and defiant and terrified. Every time the wind rattled the loose pane in the window, he looked up, expecting to see her. Every time a coyote howled in the distance, his hand went to his gun, his heart jumping with a fear he could not name. He told himself he was giving her space. He told himself he was respecting her wishes. By the 4th morning, the silence was no longer peaceful. It was a scream. Eli threw down his hammer. He didn't bother to saddle the mare properly. He just threw the blanket and the leather rig on, cinching it tight with a savage jerk. He grabbed his rifle, shoved it into the scabbard, and rode out. The snow was deep, packed hard by the wind, crusting over so that the horse's hooves broke through with a sharp, crunching sound at every step. Eli rode hard, pushing the animal more than he should have, driven by a knot of dread in his gut that tightened with every mile. When he crested the final rise that overlooked Sarah's cabin, he pulled the mare up short. The chimney was cold, no smoke, and the front door was standing wide open. "No," Eli whispered. He kicked the mare into a gallop, sliding down the icy slope. He hit the yard and vaulted from the saddle before the horse had stopped moving. Running up the steps, the door had not blown open. The latch was shattered, the wood splintered inward where a heavy boot had kicked it in. "Sarah!" He burst into the room. his gun drawn. The cabin was freezing. The air inside as bitter as the air outside. A chair was overturned. The table had been shoved askew. A crock of milk smashed on the floor. The white puddle frozen solid. In the corner, huddled on the bed under a pile of quilts, was a shape. Eli holstered his gun and rushed to the bed. He pulled back the top quilt. Sarah looked up at him. Her face was pale, translucent as skimmed milk, except for the dark, purple bruise blooming across her left cheekbone and the split in her lower lip. She was shivering violently, her arms wrapped tight around Clara, who was tucked against her chest, wailing a thin, exhausted sound. "Sarah," Eli breathed, falling to his knees beside the bed. "Sarah, look at me." Her eyes were dull, shocked. She blinked slowly, as if she didn't recognize him. "He came back," she whispered. Her voice was cracked. "Silas?" Eli's hands hovered over her, afraid to touch her, afraid to cause more pain. "Did he do this?" "He wanted us to leave," she said, the words tumbling out in a monotone. He said he was tired of looking at us. He said if I didn't pack my things and ride out of the territory, he would burn the roof down over our heads." She shuddered, pulling the baby closer. "He spat on her. Eli, he looked at Clara and he spat on her." A rage, cold and black and absolute, flooded Eli's veins. It was not the hot flare of a fight. It was the dead calm of a man who has decided to kill. He reached out and touched Sarah's shoulder, his hand trembling with the effort to be gentle. "Can you ride?" he asked. She nodded weakly. "I think so." "We are leaving," Eli said. "Now." He didn't ask for her permission. He moved with a terrifying efficiency. He righted the chair. He found her carpet bag and began throwing things into it. Clothes for the baby, her warm wool dress, the few small keepsakes on the mantel. He went to the larder and packed the food. He went outside and saddled her gelding, his movements stiff with fury. He wanted to ride to the Double T Ranch. He wanted to find Silas Thorne and beat him until he couldn't stand, until he begged for mercy. And then he wanted to put a bullet in him. But he looked back at the open door, at the woman and child freezing in the wreckage. They came first. Vengeance could wait. Survival could not. He went back inside and wrapped them in every blanket they owned. He lifted Sarah up, supporting her weight as she stumbled. He carried Clara in one arm, tucking her inside his coat. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked as he lifted her into the saddle. "Home," Eli said. "My home? You aren't staying here another night." The Vance homestead was small, but it was solid. The logs were thick, chinked with fresh mud and moss that Eli had packed in himself. The fire in the hearth was banked, but the room still held a residual warmth. Eli brought them inside. He set Clara in the center of the big feather bed, the bed his parents had shared, the bed he had been born in. He helped Sarah out of her coat. When he saw the bruise in the light of the fire, his jaw tightened until his teeth ached. "I'll kill him," he said softly. "No," Sarah said. She reached out and grabbed his wrist. Her hand was ice cold. "No, Eli, that is what he wants. He wants a reason to hang you. He came there with two of his hands waiting outside. He wanted you to be there. He wanted a fight. He hit you." "He is a coward," she said. "And cowards are dangerous when they have power. Please, just lock the door." Eli locked the door. He barred it with a heavy oak plank. Then he stoked the fire until it roared, banishing the cold that had soaked into their bones. For the first time in 7 years, the Vance cabin was not empty. The transition was strange, quiet, and terrifyingly intimate. They were not married. In the eyes of the town, they were living in sin. A fallen woman and a squatter living under one roof. But inside the walls, the moral judgments of Winmere felt very far away. They fell into a rhythm born of necessity. Eli gave them the bed. He slept on the floor in front of the fire, wrapped in his bedroll, his rifle by his side. For 2 days, Sarah barely spoke. She sat by the fire, holding Clara, her eyes tracking Eli as he moved around the room. She flinched when the wood settled in the stove. She flinched when the wind banged a shutter. But slowly, the shock began to wear off. The bruise on her cheek faded from purple to a sickly yellow-green. She began to move around the cabin. Eli watched her take ownership of the space. She didn't ask. She just did. She found his stash of flour and salt and baked biscuits that rose high and fluffy. Unlike the flat, hardtack stones he made for himself, she swept the hearth. She hung dried herbs from the rafters, sage and mint she had brought in her bag, filling the masculine scent of tobacco and leather with something sharper, cleaner. One afternoon, the sun broke through the clouds, weak but bright. "She needs air," Eli said. He was oiling a bridle at the table. Clara was pulling herself up on the bench, babbling at the shiny buckles. Sarah looked up from the pot of beans she was stirring. "It's cold." "I'll wrap her up," Eli said. "Come on, I want to show her something." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Eli bundled Clara into her woolens. He carried her out to the barn, Sarah following a few steps behind, wrapped in her shawl. The roan mare was eating hay in her stall. She was a big horse, tall at the shoulder, but she had a kind eye, Eli murmured to her, stroking her velvet nose, letting her smell the baby. "This is a horse, Clara," Eli said softly. "Big horse." Clara reached out a mittened hand, squealing. "You want to ride?" Eli asked. He looked at Sarah. "Is it all right?" Sarah stood in the doorway, the light behind her. She nodded. Eli lifted the baby high. He set her gently on the saddle of the mare, holding her steady with big hands around her tiny waist. The horse shifted her weight, her hooves clopping on the wood floor. But she didn't spook. Clara's eyes went wide. She looked down from her dizzying height, then looked at Eli. A massive grin split her face. She bounced, gripping the saddle horn with both mittens. "Look at that," Eli laughed. "She's got the seat already. Look at her back. Sarah. Straight as a ramrod." Sarah walked closer. She watched the way Eli looked at the child. The pride, the tenderness, the complete lack of hesitation. He wasn't looking at a bastard. He wasn't looking at a burden. He was looking at the future. "She's not afraid," Sarah said softly. "No reason to be," Eli said, looking at the baby. "Fear is learned. She hasn't learned it yet." He looked at Sarah then, his eyes serious. "And I won't let her learn it. Not for men like Silas." Sarah felt a crack in the wall she had built around her heart. It was a terrifying sound. That night, the wind died completely. The silence of the high plains returned, deep and vast. They ate dinner at the small table. The firelight cast long, flickering shadows against the log walls. Clara was asleep in the cradle Eli had carved from a pine stump years ago, back when he thought he would fill this house with his own children before he left. Sarah washed the tin plates. Eli dried them. The domesticity of it was an ache in his chest. It felt like he was stealing a life he didn't deserve. "Eli," Sarah said. He stopped wiping the plate. He turned to look at her. She was standing by the wash basin, her hands gripping the rim. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the dark window. "You need to know," she said. "Know what? Why did I lie?" Eli set the plate down. He walked over to the table and pulled out a chair. "Sit down. Sarah." She shook her head. "I can't sit. If I sit, I won't be able to say it." She turned to face him. Her face was pale, the firelight catching the dampness on her cheeks. "You asked me if she was Silas's," she said, "and I told you she wasn't yours. I let you believe. I let everyone believe that she came from what he did to me." Eli went still. "Sarah, you don't have to." "I do," she cut him off. "Because you look at her, and you love her, and you don't even know who she is. And it isn't fair. It isn't fair to you." She took a deep breath, her chest hitching. "He attacked me in November," she said. It was cold. The first snow had already fallen. Eli calculated. Clara had been born in May. "She was born in May," Sarah whispered. "Full term, healthy, big." Eli frowned. The math. November to May was only 6 months. A baby born at 6 months would be tiny, fragile, struggling for every breath. Clara had been a sturdy, round-cheeked infant. She wasn't early, Sarah said. She was right on time. Eli stared at her. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the gut, knocking the wind out of him. August, he whispered. August, Sarah confirmed, tears spilling over her lashes. The night in the barn, before you left. Eli grabbed the back of the chair to steady himself. The room seemed to tilt. August, the night he had come back, the night they had desperate, silent love in the hayloft, trying to fit a lifetime of longing into a few hours. She is yours, Sarah sobbed. She was already inside me when Silas broke down my door. He didn't put a child in me. Eli, he attacked a pregnant woman. Eli made a sound that was half animal, half human. He sank into the chair because his legs refused to hold him. Clara was his, the little girl with the gray eyes, the girl who laughed at the chickens, the girl he had held against his bare skin to save her life. She was his blood. She was the daughter he had dreamed of, the legacy he thought he had thrown away. And then the second wave hit him. She was his, and he had left. He had left Sarah pregnant. He had left her alone on the prairie with no money and no husband. And because he had left, Silas Thorne had come. Because he had left, Sarah had been beaten and violated while carrying his child. Oh, God! Eli groaned. He put his head in his hands, his fingers digging into his scalp. The guilt was a crushing weight, heavier than any stone he had ever lifted. Sarah, I did this. I did all of this. No, Sarah said. She crossed the room then, falling to her knees between his spread legs. She grabbed his hands, pulling them away from his face. No, Eli, you didn't hurt me. Silas hurt me. You gave me her. I left you, he roared, his voice cracking. I left you alone. And you came back, she cried back, fierce and weeping. You came back. That is what matters. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, his eyes searching her face, frantic. Why did you let me think? Because of the shame, she whispered. Not mine, hers. If I said she was yours, everyone would know she was a bastard born of a man who ran away. They would call her a mistake. But if I let them think she came from the violence, then she was a tragedy. She was something to be pitied, maybe, but not mocked. She squeezed his hands, and I was afraid. I was afraid that if you knew, you would go after Silas, and he would kill you, and then she would have no father at all. Eli looked at her, at the bruise on her cheek, the tears on her face, the strength in her jaw. She had borne the weight of the world to protect a scrap of his soul. She is mine, he said, the words full of wonder and agony. She is yours, Sarah answered. She has always been yours. Eli slid off the chair, dropping to his knees on the floorboards so he was level with her. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He held her with a desperate strength, rocking her slightly. I am sorry, he wept into her skin. I am so sorry. Sarah, I know, she whispered, stroking his hair. I know. They stayed like that for a long time, kneeling on the hard floor, the fire popping beside them. The barriers were gone. The lies were gone. There was nothing left but the raw, bleeding truth of them. Sarah pulled back slightly. She framed his face with her hands. Her thumbs brushed away the tears on his rough cheeks. I never stopped, she whispered. Even when I hated you for leaving, I loved you. I never stopped loving you. Eli. Eli looked at her mouth. He looked at the woman who had survived hell and came out with his daughter in her arms. I love you, he said. I have loved you since I was 16 years old, and I will love you until they put me in the ground. He leaned in. This time, she did not push him away. The kiss was salt and fire. It was a reclaiming. Eli kissed her with a hunger that shook him, but he was gentle, so gentle, mindful of her bruises, mindful of the violence she had endured. He wanted to rewrite the history of her body. He wanted to wash away the touch of Silas Thorne and leave only himself. He lifted her up, carrying her to the bed. He laid her down on the quilt. Are you sure? He asked, hovering over her, his voice trembling. Sarah reached up and unbuttoned his shirt. Make me forget, she whispered. Make me forget everything but you. They made love slowly, by the light of the dying fire. It was not the frantic, hurried fumbling of their youth. It was deep and slow and heavy with emotion. It was a conversation without words, a series of apologies and promises pressed into skin. When Sarah cried out, it was his name she called. And when Eli finally let go, shuddering against her, he felt like a man coming up for air after 7 years of drowning. Later, the fire burned down to glowing red coals. The room was cooling, but under the heavy bear pelt, it was warm. They lay entangled, limbs heavy and relaxed. Sarah's head rested on Eli's chest. He could feel her breathing, the steady rise and fall against his ribs. His arm was draped over her, his hand resting possessively on her hip. "We have to tell her," Eli said softly into the darkness. "Someday, when she's old enough." "We will," Sarah murmured, sleepy and safe. "And I'm going to marry you," Eli added. "As soon as the snow melts. I don't care what the preacher says. I don't care what the town says. You are going to be Sarah Vance." Sarah smiled against his skin. She kissed the scar on his chest. "I think," she whispered, "I have been Sarah Vance in my heart for a very long time." Eli pulled the bear pelt higher, tucking it around her shoulders. He listened to the wind outside, no longer afraid of it. He had his land. He had his daughter. He had his love. Let Silas Thorne come. Let the winter rage. Eli Vance wasn't going anywhere. The peace at the Vance homestead was as fragile as a sheet of new ice on a watering trough. For a week, Eli and Sarah lived in a suspended state of domestic quiet, but the world outside their log walls was not resting. The wind carried more than snow. It carried the heavy, restless energy of men who were losing their grip on power. It began on a Tuesday morning, under a sky the color of bruised iron. Eli was in the yard, splitting wood. The rhythm of the axe, thwack, crack, thwack, was the only sound in the valley until the rumble of hooves broke the silence. Eli stopped mid-swing. He rested the axe head on the chopping block and wiped his brow. Though the air was freezing, he watched the riders approach. There were 4 of them. Sheriff Amos Brady rode in front, a man with a paunch that strained the buttons of his buffalo hide coat and a face reddened by whiskey and windburn. Flanking him were 2 deputies, young men with nervous eyes, and behind them, sitting tall on a black stallion, was Silas Thorne. Silas did not look nervous. He looked like a man who owned the very air Eli was breathing. He wore a coat of fine wool with a fur collar, and his hands, gloved in kid skin, rested casually on the pommel of his saddle. Sarah had heard the horses. She appeared in the doorway of the cabin, holding Clara. Eli saw her stiffen, her face draining of color, but she did not retreat. She stood her ground. Eli walked to the fence line, the axe still in his hand. He didn't raise it, but he didn't drop it either. "Sheriff," Eli said. His voice was flat. "Vance," the sheriff grunted, pulling his horse up. He didn't make eye contact, looking instead at the roof of the cabin. "We have a problem." "I don't have a problem," Eli said. "Unless you brought one with you." Silas chuckled softly. "The problem, Mr. Vance, is that you are trespassing. I have filed a claim on this land. It has been abandoned for 7 years. Under the Territorial Homestead Act, abandoned property reverts to the public domain, available for claim by productive citizens. My father left me this land," Eli said, his knuckles whitening on the axe handle. "It isn't abandoned. I am here." "You are a squatter," Silas said, his voice smooth and venomous. "You have no deed. You have no paper. You are just a drifter shacking up with a whore in a rot-infested cabin." Eli took a step forward. The deputies put their hands on their revolvers. "Watch your mouth, Thorne," Eli warned, the sound low and dangerous like a growl. "I am issuing you a notice of eviction," Sheriff Brady interrupted, pulling a folded paper from his coat. "You have 3 days to vacate the premises. If you are still here on Friday at sundown, you will be arrested for trespassing and resisting the law. The woman and the child will be turned over to the county ward." "You can't do that," Sarah called out from the porch. her voice trembling with rage. "This is his home!" Silas turned his gaze to her. He smiled, a cold, dead expression that made Eli's blood run backward. "It's a shame. Sarah, you could have lived in a mansion. Now you'll be lucky to find a corner in the poorhouse." He turned his horse. Friday. Vance. Sundown. They rode off, the snow muffling the sound of their departure, leaving a silence behind them that felt heavier than the storm. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with panic. Sarah was moving frantically, pulling the carpet bag out from under the bed. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely work the clasps. "We have to go," she said, her voice high and tight. "Eli, we have to leave tonight. If we wait until Friday, he'll kill you. He won't arrest you. He'll just have the sheriff shoot you and say you resisted." She grabbed a stack of Clara's diapers and shoved them into the bag. "We can go to Montana. I have a cousin in Helena. It's a long ride, but if we start now—" "Stop," Eli said. He was standing by the fireplace, staring into the flames. He hadn't moved since they came inside. "Eli, please." Sarah dropped the bag and ran to him, grabbing his arm. "You saw his eyes. He owns the law here. We can't fight him with an axe handle. We have to run." Eli turned to look at her. He looked at the fear in her eyes, the same fear he had seen in the general store, the same fear that had ruled her life for a year. "I am not running," he said. "You have to." "No," Eli said gently, taking her shoulders. "I ran for 7 years. Sarah, I ran from my father. I ran from you. I ran from the responsibility of being a man. I told myself I was looking for a fortune, but I was just running away from the hardness of life." He looked over her shoulder at the cradle where Clara was sleeping. "I am done running," he said. "If I run now, I will be running for the rest of my life. And I won't teach her to be a runner. I won't teach her that the only way to survive is to hide." "But the deed!" Sarah cried. "Silas is right. You don't have the paper. Your father, he was a good man, but he was disorganized. He kept his records in a cigar box. We burned half that trash just to keep warm the first winter after he died." "Not everything," Eli said. He pulled away from her and walked to the foot of the bed. There, pushed against the wall, was a heavy trunk made of oak and bound with iron straps. It was his father's sea chest, brought over from the old country before the Vances had ever seen a cow or a prairie. Eli knelt before it. The lock was rusted, but he used the tip of his hunting knife to pry the mechanism. With a groan of protesting metal, the lid creaked open. The smell of cedar and old tobacco rose up. Inside were relics of a life, a moth-eaten uniform from the militia, a pair of broken spurs, a Bible with the cover torn off. Eli began to dig. He moved the uniform. He moved the Bible. He felt along the bottom of the trunk, his fingers searching for a seam he remembered from childhood hide-and-seek games. "Eli, what are you doing?" Sarah asked, hovering behind him. "My father didn't trust banks," Eli muttered. "And he didn't trust cigar boxes for important things." His finger found a small notch in the wood of the false bottom. He pried it up. Underneath lay a flat, oilskin packet. Eli's heart hammered against his ribs. He lifted the packet out. It was heavy. He unwrapped the oilskin, revealing a sheaf of papers yellowed with age. On top was the deed, "The United States of America to Jeremiah Vance," sealed, signed, and dated 1871. Below it was the transfer of title, signed by his father 2 weeks before he died, witnessing the land to Elijah Vance. But there was something else, a folded piece of foolscap, written in his father's shaky, blocky hand. Eli unfolded it. Sarah knelt beside him, reading over his arm. "Son," the letter read, "if you are reading this, then you have come back. I knew you would. The world is big, but the land is in the blood. I was hard on you, boy. I know that, but I built this for you. Not for the cattle, but for the family you will make. A man is nothing without a place to stand. Stand here, plant your feet, and tell that girl Sarah I said hello. I always liked her." Eli felt a stinging in his eyes. His throat closed up. He had spent 7 years thinking his father had died disappointed in him. He had spent 7 years thinking there was nothing here for him but ghosts. "He knew," Sarah whispered, her hand covering her mouth. He knew about us. Eli folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket, next to his heart. He took the deed in his hand. It felt like a weapon. It felt heavier than a Colt and sharper than a knife. "He told me to stand," Eli said, his voice thick with emotion. He stood up, pulling Sarah up with him. "So I'm going to stand." The sheriff's office in Windermere was a small, overheated room that smelled of stale tobacco smoke and unwashed bodies. Sheriff Brady sat with his boots up on the desk, peeling an apple with a pocket knife. Silas Thorne was not there, but his presence hung in the room like a bad odor. When the door opened, letting in a blast of snow and cold air, Brady looked up, annoyed. "I told you, Vance," he began. "Friday at sundown. Don't make me—" Eli slammed the deed onto the desk. The sound was like a gunshot. The apple jumped from the sheriff's hand and rolled onto the floor. "Read it," Eli said. Brady blinked. He looked at the paper, then at Eli. Eli was clean-shaven. He wore his best shirt, the one Sarah had ironed. He did not look like a drifter. He looked like the owner of 640 acres of prime Wyoming pasture. Brady picked up the paper. He squinted at the legal script. He looked at the seal. He looked at the date. "It's a forgery," Brady muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "It is a federal document," Eli said clearly. "Signed by the land commissioner in Cheyenne, and that transfer is notarized by Judge Miller. You remember Judge Miller, don't you, Amos? Before he passed, he was a stickler for paperwork." Brady swallowed. He knew Judge Miller's signature. Everyone in the territory did. Silas said the land was abandoned. Brady tried, shifting in his chair. 7 years. "And abandonment requires no intent to return," Eli cited, remembering the law his father had drilled into him. "I never relinquished the title. I paid the back taxes this morning at the clerk's office. I have the receipt right here." He slammed a second piece of paper down. Brady looked at the receipt. He looked at the deed. He looked at the grim, unyielding line of Eli's jaw. The sheriff was a corrupt man, but he was not a stupid one. He knew that if he tried to evict a man with a valid deed and paid taxes, the territorial marshal would come down on him hard. Silas Thorne paid well, but he didn't pay enough to go to federal prison. "Well," Brady said, clearing his throat. He pushed the papers back across the desk. "Seems there has been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Eli said, tucking the deed back into his coat. "Just a lie. Tell Thorne the land is mine. Tell him if he sets foot on it again. I will shoot him for trespassing, and I will have the law on my side." He turned and walked out. Brady watched him go. Then he picked up his apple, wiped it on his shirt, and took a bite. "Damn," he muttered. "Silas ain't going to like this." For 2 days, the victory was held. The threat of eviction vanished. The town, hearing of the deed, began to shift its murmurings. People respected paper. A man with a deed wasn't a squatter. He was a neighbor. But Eli knew it wasn't over. He knew men like Silas Thorne did not accept defeat. They only changed their tactics. It was late Thursday when the trap was sprung. Sarah needed to go to her old cabin. She had left her mother's locket hidden beneath a loose floorboard, and in the haste of their escape, she had forgotten it. It was the only thing she had left of her mother. "I'll go," Eli had offered. "You won't find it," she said. "It's wedged in tight. Besides, I need to check the root cellar. If there are still potatoes there, we shouldn't leave them to freeze." Eli didn't like it. The air felt heavy, charged with static, but the sheriff had backed off, and Silas had been unseen for 48 hours. "We go together," Eli said, "and we take the rifle." They rode out in the late afternoon. The sun was setting early, casting long, violet shadows across the snow. Sarah rode her gelding. Clara bundled tight against her chest in a papoose-style sling Eli had fashioned from a blanket. Eli rode the roan mare, his Winchester resting across his saddle horn. The ride to the old cabin was uneventful. The world was silent and white. They reached the cabin as the sun dipped below the horizon. Sarah dismounted, handing the reins to Eli. "I'll be quick," she said. 5 minutes." She ran up the steps and disappeared into the dark, broken house. Eli sat on his horse, his eyes scanning the tree line. The woods were dark, a tangle of black trunks against the blue snow. Something was wrong. The birds were silent. "Sarah!" Eli called out. "Hurry!" "Got it," she yelled back from inside. She appeared in the doorway a moment later, clutching the silver locket. She started down the steps. A crack echoed from the trees. The bullet struck the porch post inches from Sarah's head, sending a spray of splinters into her hair. She screamed, ducking low, shielding Clara with her body. "Get down!" Eli roared. He spurred the mare, driving her between Sarah and the tree line. Swinging his rifle up, a second shot rang out. Eli felt a hammer blow to his left side, just above the hip. The impact nearly knocked him from the saddle. A burning, white-hot pain seared through him. "Eli!" Sarah shrieked. "Get inside!" Eli shouted, gritting his teeth against the pain. He jacked the lever of the Winchester. He saw the muzzle flash from a cluster of pines 50 yards away. He fired. Bang! He jacked the lever. Fired again. Bang! A figure stumbled out from behind a tree. It wasn't a hired gun. It was Silas. Silas was roaring, a sound of pure, incoherent rage. He had a revolver in each hand, firing wildly. He wasn't aiming, he was just trying to destroy. Eli's mare danced and spun, panicked by the noise. Eli fought to control her with one hand, the reins slick with his own blood, while he tried to aim the rifle with the other. "You bastard!" Silas screamed, advancing through the deep snow. "It's mine! All of it is mine!" He fired again. The bullet grazed the mare's flank. She reared, screaming. Eli lost his seat. He hit the frozen ground hard. The air left his lungs. The rifle flew from his hand and landed 10 feet away in a snowbank. Eli rolled onto his back, gasping. His side was on fire. He looked up to see Silas Thorne standing over him, a dark silhouette against the darkening sky. Silas was breathing hard, steam puffing from his mouth. He aimed his right-hand Colt at Eli's chest. "You should have run, cowboy," Silas sneered. Inside the cabin doorway, Sarah saw it all. She saw the man she loved lying in the snow, blood staining the white crust red. She saw the monster who had ruined her life raising a gun to finish the job. She didn't think so. She didn't tremble. She set Clara down on the floorboards of the porch, behind the cover of the wall. "Stay," she whispered. Sarah grabbed the handle of the axe, the same axe Eli had used to fix her fence weeks ago, which he had left leaning against the rail. She ran. She didn't scream. She ran with a silent, feral intensity. She flew down the steps and across the yard. Silas heard the crunch of snow. He turned his head, distracted for a split second. It was enough. Eli saw his chance. He didn't reach for the rifle. He reached for the knife in his boot. Sarah swung the axe. It was heavy, and she wasn't strong enough to deliver a killing blow, but the flat of the blade struck Silas's arm with a sickening crack. Silas howled, dropping the gun. He backhanded Sarah with his other hand, a vicious blow that sent her sprawling into the snow. "No!" Eli roared. He lunged. He drove upward from the ground, ignoring the agony in his side. He tackled Silas around the waist, driving him back. They went down in a tangle of limbs and coats. Silas was bigger, heavier, but Eli was fighting for more than his life. He was fighting for Sarah. He was fighting for Clara. Silas punched Eli in the wound. Eli blacked out for a second, seeing stars, but he didn't let go. He jammed his forearm against Silas's throat, pinning him to the frozen earth. Silas clawed at Eli's face, gouging his cheek. He bucked, throwing Eli off. Silas scrambled for the dropped gun. Eli grabbed the Winchester from the snowbank. He rolled onto his stomach. Silas raised the Colt. Eli fired from the hip. The boom of the rifle was deafening. Silas jerked backward as if pulled by an invisible wire. He collapsed into the snow, clutching his thigh. A dark stain spread rapidly across his fine wool trousers. He screamed, a high, thin sound of agony. Eli jacked the lever again. He aimed the rifle at Silas's head. His hands were steady now. "Finish it!" Silas gasped, looking up with hate-filled eyes. Go on. Hang for it. Eli's finger tightened on the trigger. Every instinct in him screamed to do it, to end the threat, to wipe the earth clean of this man. Eli! Sarah's voice cut through the red haze. She was sitting up in the snow, holding her jaw, but she was looking at him. Don't, she said. Don't become him. Eli froze. He looked at Sarah. He looked at Clara, who was wailing from the porch. He looked at the blood on his own hands. He lowered the rifle. The sound of approaching horses thundered down the road. Sheriff Brady and half a dozen townsfolk, men from the saloon, the blacksmith, the storekeep, burst into the clearing. They had heard the shots. They saw the scene. Eli Vance bleeding but standing tall with a rifle. Sarah Cross bruised but fierce. Silas Thorne writhing in the snow, a gun near his hand, shot in the leg. He ambushed us, Eli said, his voice raspy. He shot me. He tried to kill her. The blacksmith, a burly man named John, stepped forward. He looked at the axe mark on the porch post. He looked at the 2 guns Silas had dropped. I saw him ride out, John said, turning to the sheriff. He said he was going to finish the job. We all heard him. Amos. Sheriff Brady looked at Silas. The power had shifted. The town was watching. The paperwork was signed. Silas was bleeding out in the snow. A failed murderer. Get the doc, Brady told one of the men. He walked over to Silas and kicked the Colt away. Silas Thorne, you're under arrest for attempted murder. Silas cursed him. But the fight was gone. Eli dropped the rifle. He turned and stumbled towards Sarah. His legs gave out. Sarah caught him. She wasn't big enough to hold him up, so they sank into the snow together. You're hurt, she sobbed, pressing her hands against his side. Oh, God, Eli, you're bleeding so much. I'm all right, he whispered, leaning his forehead against hers. It's over. Sarah, it's over. The ride back to the homestead was a blur of pain and cold. The doctor, a sober man for once, had bound Eli's wound tight enough to stop the bleeding, but the bullet was still inside. I have to take it out, the doctor had said. But he needs to be warm. Get him home. Back at the cabin, the fire was built up until the room was sweltering. Eli lay on the table, stripped to the waist. The doctor worked by lamplight, digging for the lead. Eli gripped the edge of the table until the wood creaked. He didn't scream. He grunted, sweat pouring off his body. But he kept his eyes on Sarah. She was standing by his head, wiping his face with a damp cloth. She was pale, her hands trembling, but she didn't look away. Got it, the doctor said, dropping a flattened piece of lead into a tin cup with a clink. Missed the gut, hit the hip bone. He's lucky. He'll limp when it rains, but he'll walk. The doctor stitched the wound, 10 neat, black stitches, and bandaged it. He left an hour later, promising to check in the morning. The cabin was quiet. Sarah helped Eli off the table and into the bed. She propped him up with pillows. She washed the blood from his skin. She sat on the edge of the bed, the basin of water on her lap. She dipped the rag and cleaned a smear of blood from his neck. Suddenly, her hand stopped. She dropped the rag into the water. Her shoulders began to shake. Sarah, Eli whispered. You could have died. She wept. She covered her face with her hands. You could have died because of me, because I was too weak to leave, because I brought this darkness into your life. Sarah, look at me. I never deserved you, she cried, the words muffled by her palms. I am broken. Eli, I am used up and full of secrets, and I almost got you killed. You should have let me go. You should have never come back to the store. Eli reached out. His movement was stiff and painful, but he ignored it. He grabbed her wrists and pulled her hands away from her face. Listen to me, he said. His voice was rough, but fierce. You listen to me. He held her gaze. You are not broken. You are the strongest woman I have ever known. You took an axe to a man twice your size to save me. You survived a winter alone to save our daughter. He squeezed her hands. I lived half a life out there on the trail. Sarah, I was hollow. I was just a body moving through the world. You and that little girl. You filled me up. You gave me a reason to stand." He pulled her hand to his chest, pressing it over his heart so she could feel the steady, strong beat of it. "You aren't a burden," he whispered. "You are my whole life. Without you, this land is just dirt. Without you, I am just a ghost. Do you understand?" Sarah looked at him. She saw the truth in his eyes, gray like his mother's, gray like Clara's, full of a love that terrified and healed her all at once. She leaned down and kissed him. It was a soft, salty kiss, tasting of tears and survival. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "I know," he said. "Now come here. It's cold." She blew out the lamp. She climbed into the bed beside him. Careful of his bandaged side, she lay her head on his shoulder. Outside, the snow began to fall again. Big, soft flakes that covered the blood in the yard, covered the tracks of the fight, covered the scars on the land. It was a clean, white blanket, preparing the earth for spring. In the corner, in the pine cradle. Clara sighed in her sleep. She turned her head, her small hand curling into a fist, safe and warm. Eli listened to the wind. It wasn't howling anymore. It was singing. He closed his eyes and slept without dreaming. The Wyoming winter did not surrender easily. It fought a retreating battle, clinging to the shadows of the canyons and the north side of the barn long after the sun had begun to warm the southern slopes. But eventually, the relentless march of the calendar and the warm Chinook winds coming over the mountains broke the back of the freeze. The silence of the snow was replaced by the noise of water. It dripped from the eaves in a steady, rhythmic drumming. It rushed in the creek, swollen and brown with mud. It squelched under the boots of Eli Vance as he walked the fence line, checking for posts heaved up by the frost. He walked with a slight hitch in his gait now. The bullet from Silas Thorne's gun had left him with a stiffness in his left hip that the damp weather aggravated, a permanent reminder of the price he had paid for this land. But he did not mind the pain. It was an anchor. It was proof that he had stood his ground. Inside the cabin, the air had changed too. The heavy, suffocating scent of fear and wood smoke had lifted, replaced by the smell of baking bread and the fresh breeze drifting through the open door. Sarah stood by the table, kneading dough. Her hands were strong, her arms dusted with flour. She looked out the window at the green shoots of grass pushing up through the melting slush in the yard. She was different now. The hunted look was gone from her eyes. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a memory, leaving her skin pale and smooth. But there was a steeliness in her posture that hadn't been there before, a quiet confidence born of surviving the worst the world could throw at her. Clara was on the floor, pulling herself up on the leg of a chair. She was nearly a year old, a sturdy, determined child with a mop of hair that was turning darker, losing its infant fuzz and taking on the rich brown of Eli's own unruly mane. "Dada!" Clara shrieked, pointing at the door as Eli's shadow crossed the threshold. Eli stomped the mud from his boots and came inside. He smelled of wet earth and pine resin. He hung his hat on the peg and scooped Clara up, tossing her toward the rafters until she giggled, a sound that was pure sunshine. "Fence is holding," Eli said, settling the baby on his hip. He looked at Sarah. "Creek is high, though, might lose the lower bridge." "Let it go," Sarah said, smiling. "We can build a better one when the water drops." Eli watched her. He watched the way the sunlight caught the stray hairs escaping her bun. He watched the easy grace with which she turned the dough. He felt that familiar swell in his chest, that overwhelming sense of gratitude that he was allowed to be here, in this room, with these people. "I need to go into town tomorrow," Sarah said, her voice casual, though her hands paused for a fraction of a second. "We need seed potatoes. And clothes. Clara has outgrown everything she owns." Eli went still. Since the night of the shooting, Sarah had not been back to Winmere. Eli had gone for supplies, riding in and out quickly, ignoring the stares. "I can go," Eli offered. "No," Sarah said. She turned to face him, wiping her hands on her apron. "I need to go. I am done hiding. Eli, we did nothing wrong. I won't live like a prisoner on my own homestead." Eli studied her face. He saw the fear there, buried deep, but he saw the resolve sitting on top of it. "All right," he said. "We'll hitch the wagon." The ride into Windermere the next morning was slow. The road was a mire of gumbo mud that sucked at the wheels of the buckboard wagon. The roan mare and the gelding pulled together, their breath steaming in the crisp spring air. Sarah sat straight on the bench seat, Clara on her lap. She wore her best dress, the charcoal wool, brushed clean and pressed. She wore a bonnet that shadowed her face, but she kept her chin high. As they rolled onto the main street, the town seemed to pause. A man sweeping the boardwalk stopped and leaned on his broom. Two women standing outside the millinery shop ceased their chatter and turned to watch. The blacksmith looked up from his anvil. Sarah felt the weight of their eyes. She felt the heat rising in her cheeks, the phantom echo of the whispers that had dogged her for a year. The fallen woman, the liar, the squatter's mistress. Eli reached over and covered her hand with his. His grip was warm and calloused. He didn't look at the town. He looked straight ahead, driving the team with a relaxed confidence that dared anyone to speak. They pulled up in front of the mercantile. Eli hopped down, wincing slightly as his bad leg hit the ground, and came around to lift Sarah and Clara down. He offered his arm. Sarah took it. They walked into the store. The bell chimed. Old man Miller was behind the counter, weighing sugar. He looked up. His eyes widened slightly behind his spectacles. He looked from Eli to Sarah, and then to the baby. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. "Morning, Mr. Miller," Eli said, his voice booming in the quiet room. "We need 50 pounds of seed potatoes and a bolt of flannel." Miller cleared his throat. He looked at Sarah. He had known her since she was a girl. He had sold her peppermint sticks when she was 5. He had also listened to Silas Thorne call her a whore in this very room. But Silas Thorne was sitting in a county jail cell in Cheyenne, awaiting trial for attempted murder. The shadow of the Double T Ranch had lifted from the valley. "Morning, Eli," Miller said. He turned his gaze to Sarah. He hesitated, then nodded. "Morning, Miss Sarah. Good to see you out. It's been a long winter." "It has," Sarah said, her voice steady. "But spring is here." Miller's eyes dropped to Clara. The baby was staring at a jar of colorful ribbons on the counter. She reached out a chubby hand, making a grasping motion. Miller's face softened. He reached into the jar and pulled out a length of satin ribbon, bright yellow like a dandelion. He walked around the counter and held it out. "For the little one," Miller said. "On the house. She's got a look of your mother about her. Sarah. Martha was a good woman." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Sudden and hot. It was a small thing, a ribbon and a memory. But it felt like a wall coming down. It was an acknowledgement. It was a welcome. "Thank you," Sarah whispered. She took the ribbon and tied it around Clara's wrist. Clara waved her arm, delighted by the flash of color. "Thank you, Mr. Miller," Eli said, his voice thick. As they walked out of the store, a woman Sarah knew, Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, was walking past. She stopped. She looked Sarah up and down, her eyes critical. Sarah braced herself for a snub. "That coat is too thin for the baby." "Sarah, Mrs. Gable said gruffly. "The wind still has a bite. I have a wool sack coat my youngest outgrew. It's in good shape. You stop by the bakery before you leave. You hear?" Sarah blinked. A smile, genuine and relieved, broke across her face. "I will, Mrs. Gable. Thank you." They walked back to the wagon. Sarah felt lighter, as if the heavy mud of the road had fallen away from her soul. The town was not perfect. There were still people staring, still people who would whisper. But the venom was gone. The fear was gone. She was just a woman with her family, buying potatoes. 2 weeks later, the apple trees bloomed. The orchard was small, only 6 trees that Eli's father had planted 20 years ago, but they had survived the neglect. Now, they exploded into clouds of white and pink blossoms, their sweet scent drifting across the yard. It was evening. The sun was sinking behind the peaks. painting the sky in riots of violet and gold. Clara was sitting in the grass near the porch, ripping up handfuls of clover and laughing as the family goat tried to eat them from her hand. Eli and Sarah sat on the porch steps. Eli was whittling a new latch for the root cellar. Sarah was mending a shirt. It was a quiet moment, one of 100 they had shared since the snow melted. But tonight, Eli seemed restless. He kept putting the knife down, then picking it up. He cleared his throat. "Sarah," he said. She didn't look up from her needlework. "The preacher is coming through tomorrow. Circuit rider. He'll be holding service at the schoolhouse. We should go," Sarah said. "I'd like Clara to hear the music." "I was thinking," Eli said. He stopped whittling. He brushed the shavings from his trousers. "I was thinking we might ask him to stop here, on his way out." Sarah looked up then. She saw Eli's hands were trembling slightly, hands that could rope a steer or shoot a coin out of the air. Shaking. "Why would we ask him to stop here?" she asked softly. Eli reached into his vest pocket. He pulled out a ring. It wasn't gold. It was a simple band of polished iron, hammered smooth and set with a small, distinctive agate stone, the kind found in the creek beds of the territory. "I don't have money for a jeweler," Eli said, his voice rough. "I made this, hammered it out of a carriage bolt, and polished the stone myself. It's strong. Sarah, it won't break." He slid off the step onto one knee in the grass. Clara looked over, curious, a fistful of clover hanging from her mouth. "I told you I would marry you," Eli said. "But I want to ask you properly. I want to give you my name. I want to give you everything I have, which isn't much but this land and these 2 hands." He looked at her, his gray eyes open and vulnerable. "Sarah Cross, you are the only thing I ever wanted. Will you take me? Will you be my wife?" Sarah put down the shirt. She looked at the man kneeling in the dirt. She looked at the scar on his neck from the barbed wire, the lines around his eyes from the sun, the limp he would carry forever because he had fought for her. She thought of the young boy she had kissed by the river. She thought of the drifter who had returned. She thought of the father who had warmed her child with his own body. "It isn't much." Eli started to apologize, looking at the iron ring. "It is everything," Sarah choked out. Tears spilled down her cheeks, hot and happy. "Yes, yes, Eli, 1,000 times yes." He took her hand, her work rough, scarred hand, and slid the iron ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He stood up and pulled her into his arms. They kissed on the porch of the home they had fought for, while their daughter clapped her hands in the grass, cheering for a joy she felt but didn't yet understand. The wedding was small. It was just the 3 of them and the Reverend Thomas, an old man with a face like a dried apple and a Bible that was falling apart. They stood in the parlor of the cabin, with the fire crackling and the smell of pine boughs Sarah had gathered filling the room. Sarah wore a dress of pale blue calico, sewn from the cloth she had bought in town. She held a bouquet of wildflowers, larkspur and paintbrush. Eli wore his dark suit, cleaned and brushed, his boots polished to a shine. Clara sat on the braided rug, chewing on the preacher's hat which he had unwisely left on a chair. "Do you, Elijah, take this woman?" the Reverend asked. "I do," Eli said. He didn't look at the preacher. He looked at Sarah, anchoring himself to her. "Do you, Sarah, take this man?" "I do," she whispered. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, the relief that washed over Sarah was profound. It wasn't that she needed the paper to know they were committed. It was the safety of it, the legitimacy. She was Sarah Vance. No one could question her place here. No one could call her child a bastard. They signed the marriage license on the kitchen table. That afternoon, they worked in the garden. It didn't feel like a honeymoon, perhaps to be hoeing rows for corn and beans, but to them, it was the finest celebration imaginable. They were building. They were planting seeds in the ground that they owned, under a sky that covered a family. The summer came hot and dry. The grass turned golden, and the crickets sang in the tall wheat grass. The homestead flourished. The garden burst into life, yielding rows of green beans and squash. Eli bought a small herd of goats. their bells tinkling on the hillside as they grazed. But the West was never fully tamed, and peace was never guaranteed. It was late August, exactly 1 year since Eli had returned. The heat was shimmering off the ground in waves. Eli was a mile out, fixing a break in the upper pasture fence. Sarah was at the cabin, hanging laundry on the line. Clara was napping inside. Sarah heard the horse before she saw it. She paused, a wet sheet in her hand, and shaded her eyes. A single rider was coming up the track. He rode a tall bay horse and wore a long duster. Despite the heat, he did not ride like a neighbor. He rode with a purpose. Sarah dropped the sheet. She walked to the porch and picked up the Winchester rifle that Eli insisted she keep loaded by the door. She jacked a shell into the chamber, the sound loud and metallic in the quiet afternoon. The rider pulled up 10 yards from the porch. He was a big man, heavy-set, with a face that looked like it had been chiseled from granite. He had the same dark, flat eyes as Silas Thorne. It was Judd Thorne, Silas's older brother, a man with a reputation for violence that stretched all the way to Texas. Sarah held the rifle level, the stock pressed against her shoulder. She did not tremble. "I'm looking for Vance," Judd said. His voice was gravel. "He isn't here," Sarah said. "And you are trespassing," Judd sneered. It was the same expression Silas had worn, but where Silas had been arrogant, Judd was cold. "You're the woman. The reason my brother is rotting in a cell—" "Your brother is in a cell because he tried to kill a man and a child," Sarah said. "He earned his place." Judd shifted in his saddle. His hand drifted toward the pistol at his hip. "Silas is soft. He let a skirt and a squatter take what was his. I ain't soft. Mrs. Vance, I came to tell your husband that this land dispute ain't over. The Thorns don't lose. The law says otherwise," Sarah said. "The deed is ours. Paper burns," Judd said. "And accidents happen. Barns catch fire. Men fall off horses." He nudged his horse a step closer. "Maybe I'll start by teaching you a lesson in respect." Sarah didn't blink. She didn't step back. She raised the barrel of the Winchester so it was pointed directly at Judd's chest. "Take your hand off that pistol," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of a woman who had walked through hell and come out the other side. "If you touch that gun, I will put a bullet through you before you clear the leather. I am not the woman my husband is. He might aim for your leg. I won't." Judd froze. He looked at her. He looked at the steadiness of the rifle barrel. He looked at the eyes of the woman standing on the porch, eyes that were fierce, unyielding, and utterly without fear. He had come expecting a cowering girl. He had found a matriarch defending her den. Judd slowly moved his hand away from his gun. He spat on the ground. "Crazy bitch," he muttered. "Get off my land," Sarah said. "And tell your family if any Thorn crosses that property line again, they won't be riding back out." Judd stared at her for a long moment. Then, he wheeled his horse around. He kicked it into a gallop, riding away down the track, dust billowing behind him. Sarah stood there until he was gone. She didn't lower the rifle until the dust settled. Then, she sat down on the porch steps and took a deep breath. She wasn't shaking. She felt a strange, calm pride. She had saved herself. When Eli came riding back an hour later, frantic because he had seen the dust of a stranger, he found Sarah calmly folding the laundry. She told him what happened. Eli listened, his face pale. He reached for her, to check her for injuries, to comfort her. "I'm all right, Eli," she said, pulling him into a hug. "He's gone, and he won't be back. He saw—" "Saw what?" Eli asked. "He saw that we aren't afraid," Sarah said. Autumn came again, painting the aspens in the high country a brilliant, trembling gold. The air turned crisp, smelling of cured hay and apples. On a Sunday afternoon, the work was done. The harvest was in the root cellar, potatoes, carrots, turnips. The hay was stacked in the barn. The woodpile was high. Sarah stood in the doorway of the cabin, a mug of cider in her hand. She watched the corral. Eli was there with the roan mare, and sitting on the saddle, looking tiny but regal, was Clara. She was 18 months old now, fearless and loud. Eli was walking the horse slowly around the pen, his hand resting on Clara's back to steady her. He was talking to her, explaining the movement of the horse, the way to hold the reins. Clara wasn't listening to the instruction. She was throwing her head back and laughing at the blue sky, her legs kicking against the saddle leathers. "Higher, Dada! Fast!" she commanded in her baby language. Eli laughed. "Not fast yet, little bit. We walk before we run." He looked up and saw Sarah watching them. He stopped the horse. The wind blew across the prairie, bending the grass in long, silver waves. It caught Sarah's hair, blowing it across her face. She brushed it back, leaning against the doorframe. She looked at her husband, a man who had come home from the wilderness to build a world for them. She looked at her daughter, a child born of a lie but raised in the purest truth. She looked at the land, scarred, difficult, beautiful, and theirs. Eli said something to Clara, and the little girl looked toward the house. She saw her mother and beamed, her eyes gray as storm clouds, gray as Eli's, crinkled at the corners. Sarah felt a peace settle over her, deep and final. The past was a story they would tell someday, but it was no longer a ghost that haunted them. They had survived the winter. They had survived the hate. They had survived the silence. "She has your eyes," Sarah whispered to the wind. Though Eli couldn't hear her, Eli waved. Clara mimicked him, waving her chubby hand. Sarah smiled. It wasn't the tight, guarded smile of the woman in the general store. It wasn't the sad smile of the girl at the graveside. It was a smile without pain. It was the smile of a woman who was exactly where she belonged. She took a sip of the cider, tasting the sweetness of their own apples, and stepped off the porch to join them in the sun. Thank you so much for listening to this story. The Baby's Not Yours. It has been a journey through the hardships and triumphs of the American West. And I hope you enjoyed following Eli and Sarah's path to redemption as much as I enjoyed writing it. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment down below telling me which state or country you call home. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of love, survival, and the rugged frontier, please consider subscribing to From Wild West. I have many more stories to tell from the years between 1850 and 1900. Finally, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the ending. Did Sarah's journey resonate with you? Let me know in the comments in English. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart open.